Premium content, stunning 3D visuals, and powerful stories that you have truly never heard before. Give us just 20 seconds to completely change your view of the world around you. Hit that subscribe button and start your experience. I built your dream with my own hands, and you handed it to her while I was still in the room. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment to thank you for being here. This channel exists because of people like you, people who believe that dignity is worth protecting, that silence can be a weapon, and that walking away from the wrong person is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been with me for a while, you already know that the stories we tell here are about more than revenge. They're about reclaiming yourself. Now, let me tell you about the night I sat at a dinner table, smiled at my husband's business partner, and said 4 words that ended 12 years of my life and started everything I have now. Her name was Serena. And she didn't just take my husband. She tried to take the company I built him from the ground up. She almost succeeded. My name is Rachel. I'm 43 years old. I'm a certified public accountant, and for the last 12 years, I was also a wife, a silent co-founder, and as I would come to understand far too late, a financial safety net disguised as a partner. I met my husband, Daniel, when we were both 29. He was charming the way certain men are charming, not loudly, not obviously, but in that quiet, deliberate way that makes you feel like you're the only person in the room. He had ideas. Big ones. He talked about building something that mattered, something that would outlast both of us. And I believed him, not because I was naive, but because I believed in him. There's a difference. One is about your judgment. The other is about your heart. I was wrong about both. Daniel wanted to start a logistics consulting firm. He had the vision, the industry contacts, the kind of confident storytelling that makes investors lean forward in their chairs. What he didn't have was capital. I did. My grandmother had passed away 2 years before we married, and she left me $420,000 money she had saved her entire life working as a seamstress. She used to say that money was freedom sewn into every hem. I think about that a lot now. I gave Daniel $300,000 of that money to start the firm. Not as a loan. As a partnership. We shook hands over dinner at the kitchen table, our kitchen table, and he looked me in the eye and said, "We're building this together, Rach. Every brick of it is ours." I did the books. I managed the accounts. I wrote the financial projections that got them their first major contract. I worked evenings after my full-time job, weekends when he was golfing with clients, holidays when he said he needed to stay mentally fresh. I didn't complain because I believed what we were building was ours. The company grew. By year 6, they had 11 employees, 3 long-term contracts, and enough annual revenue that Daniel was able to quit his separate consulting role and run the firm full-time. I kept my accounting job because we agreed it was smart to have stable income while the business was still maturing. That was the plan. Our plan. Looking back, I can tell you exactly when things began to shift. It wasn't dramatic. It never is. It was small, the kind of small that you explain away because you're busy, because you're tired, because you trust the person sleeping next to you. Daniel started working later. Not every night, just often enough that it stopped feeling unusual. He started taking his phone to the bathroom. He started using words like "we" at work that didn't include me. He began referring to the firm as my company in conversations, a shift so subtle I only noticed it in retrospect. When I mentioned the books, he started saying things like, "Don't worry about that, I've got someone handling it now." When I asked who, he said a new financial consultant he'd brought on to help with scaling. I didn't push, I trusted him. I should have pushed. The consultant's name was Serena. He described her to me as a former colleague from his industry days. A specialist in operational finance, exactly the kind of person the firm needed at this stage. He showed me her LinkedIn profile. Impressive background. A few mutual connections. I remember thinking she seemed qualified. I remember feeling no alarm. That memory embarrasses me now. I met Serena for the first time at the firm's annual client dinner, an event Daniel hosted every November at a private dining room downtown. I had attended every year since the company's founding. I helped choose the venues, the menus, the centerpieces. That year, Daniel had handled everything himself. He said he wanted to take something off my plate. Serena was already at the table when I arrived. She was in her mid-30s, polished in the way that reads as effortless but isn't, and she greeted me with the specific warmth of someone who has already decided how much of themselves to show you. She said, "You must be Rachel. Daniel talks about you all the time." I smiled and shook her hand and thought nothing of it. Dinner went smoothly. The clients were pleased. The conversation flowed. Daniel was in his element, animated, funny, magnetic. I watched him from across the table the way you watch someone you've loved for a long time, with a kind of settled familiarity. I thought, we've built something real. I thought, look at what we made. I didn't know that 2 weeks before that dinner, Daniel had filed an amendment to the company's operating agreement. I didn't know that Serena's name was now on it. I didn't know that the amendment had quietly reclassified my original capital contribution, the $300,000, as a personal loan from me to Daniel, not as an equity investment. Not as a founding partnership. A loan. With a repayment clause that had, conveniently, already been satisfied by a series of transfers I had never authorized and couldn't account for. I found out the way you find out about most things you weren't supposed to know. By accident. By being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong document open on a shared computer. It was a Tuesday evening in January. Daniel was traveling for a conference. I was at the kitchen counter with my laptop, looking for a vendor invoice I needed for our personal tax return. I opened the shared drive we'd used for years to store household financial documents. The folder structure had been reorganized. I clicked into a subfolder labeled Business Archive looking for an old receipt. And there it was. The amended operating agreement. Dated November 3rd, 11 days before that dinner. I read it 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time, more slowly. Because I kept hoping I was misunderstanding something. I wasn't. I closed the laptop. I sat in my kitchen for a long time with the lights off. I am a certified public accountant. I have spent 20 years working with financial documents, contracts, corporate structures. I understood exactly what I was looking at. I understood what had been done and how carefully it had been done. The paperwork was clean. It would hold up. Someone had made sure of that. I did not cry. I want you to understand that, not because I'm made of stone, but because something shifted in me in that moment that I can only describe as a kind of terrible clarity. The grief would come later. That night, sitting in my dark kitchen, what I felt was something colder and more focused. I felt like someone who had been asleep and had just, finally, opened her eyes. I did not call Daniel. I called my attorney. Her name is Margaret, and she is 61 years old and has the energy of someone who has been waiting her entire career for exactly this kind of case. It was 9:30 at night. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I'd found. There was a pause, and then she said, "Don't touch anything. Don't move anything. And don't tell him you know." I said, "I know." She said, "I mean it, Rachel." Not a word. Not a look. Not a change in routine. I said, "I understand." And I did. Because I had spent 12 years being the quiet one, the background one, the one who kept the books and held the structure together while someone else stood at the front of the room and took the credit. I knew how to be invisible. I knew how to stay calm while everything inside me was screaming. What I didn't know yet, what Margaret would discover over the following 3 weeks, was the full shape of what had been done. The reclassification of my investment was only the beginning. Daniel had also been making transfers from the business operating account into a separate entity, a holding company registered in Delaware, for the past 14 months. Serena was listed as the managing member of that entity. The transfers totaled just over $200,000. My money, flowing through my husband's company, into a structure built for a woman I had shaken hands with over dinner and thought nothing of. Margaret laid it out for me across a conference table on a Wednesday afternoon. She had printed everything. She set it in front of me in a neat stack and let me read through it in silence. When I looked up, she said, "You have a case. A very strong one. But I want to talk to you about how we proceed." I asked her what she meant. She said, "We can move immediately, freeze the accounts, file for divorce, initiate litigation against both of them. Or we can wait a little longer, gather the complete picture, and make sure that when this happens, it happens in a way that leaves you with everything you're owed." I looked at the stack of documents in front of me. I said, "How long?" She said, 3 weeks. Maybe 4. I said, "Tell me what I need to do." What I needed to do, it turned out, was continue being invisible. I needed to go home every evening to my husband, have dinner with him, ask about his day, and show none of what I knew on my face. I needed to be Rachel the steady, Rachel the quiet, Rachel the one who handles the background. I had played that role for 12 years. Daniel made it easier than I expected. He was cheerful those weeks. Relaxed. He brought home flowers once which he hadn't done in years, and I put them in a vase on the kitchen table and thanked him and felt absolutely nothing. He suggested we take a trip in the spring, somewhere warm, a reset. I said that sounded lovely. I smiled and I meant none of it, and he didn't notice, because he had never been particularly good at paying attention to me. Margaret also discovered something I hadn't known and wouldn't have guessed. The nature of Daniel and Serena's relationship predated his description of her as a professional contact. They had, in fact, worked together 8 years earlier before the firm existed, before my investment, before the company I had financed and kept afloat through 3 difficult quarters. They had been involved. Briefly, Daniel would later claim. Briefly. I thought about the night I had met her. Her easy smile. "Daniel talks about you all the time." I thought about the way she had poured her own water without being asked, like someone comfortable in a room she expected to own eventually. The 4th week of February. Daniel told me that he was hosting a small business dinner, just him, Serena, and 2 of the firm's largest clients. He said it was a relationship maintenance event, low-key, and that I was welcome to come, but that he knew I'd been busy and didn't want to put pressure on me. He said it so casually, so generously. The way you offer someone a choice you've already decided for them. I said, "I'd love to come." He looked surprised. Just briefly. Then he smiled and said, "Great." We went to a private dining room at a restaurant I had been to before one of the clients had chosen it. The table was set for 5. I arrived with Daniel. Serena was already there, standing near the bar with one of the clients, laughing at something he'd said. She turned when we walked in. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did, very slightly, the way a door shifts in a frame when the air pressure changes. She said, "Rachel. I was hoping you'd make it." I said, "Wouldn't miss it." We sat. The dinner began. It was fine, then pleasant, then convivial in the way that expensive meals with good wine tend to be. The clients were easy company. Daniel was performing his role well. Serena was performing hers. I was performing mine. Somewhere between the entree and dessert, one of the clients turned to me. He was asking about the firm's early years, how the whole thing got started, the origin story, and I opened my mouth to answer, and Serena cut in. Smoothly, not rudely, the way someone does when they've done it before. She said, "Daniel built this from real conviction. Some people have an idea, and they talk about it forever. He was different, he just did it." She glanced at me briefly, the kind of glance that doesn't linger but is designed to land. He always had the drive. It just needed the right environment to come out. The table nodded. Daniel smiled. The client said something appreciative. I set down my fork. I looked at the table for a moment, the white linen, the candles, the good crystal, and I thought of my grandmother at her sewing machine. I thought of $300,000. I thought of 11 years of evenings doing books that weren't mine to do alone. I thought of Margaret's voice on the phone. "Don't move anything. Not a word. Not a look." Then I looked up and I smiled, the kind of smile that takes practice to make look easy, and I said, very pleasantly, very quietly, in the middle of that beautiful, expensive room, "It's wonderful that Daniel had such a strong foundation to build on." Speaking of foundations, I've actually been reviewing some of the firm's early documentation recently. Fascinating how much structure goes into the original investment records. The founding contributions, the capital sources, that sort of thing. I picked up my water glass. I always find it valuable to make sure everyone at the table understands where things actually came from. There was a half-second of silence. Serena's expression didn't change. But Daniel's did. It was almost nothing, a flicker, a stillness, the specific stillness of a person who has just understood that something they believed was secure is no longer secure. I watched it move across his face and then disappear as he reassembled his smile. The client said something about the importance of financial transparency. The conversation moved on. The dessert arrived. I drove home separately that night. I had arrived in my own car, which Daniel had noted but not questioned. When I got home, I texted Margaret 3 words: "We can proceed." The next morning, I did not go to work. What happened instead? Margaret filed for divorce. Simultaneously, she filed an emergency motion to freeze the assets of both the firm and the Delaware holding company, based on documented evidence of fraudulent transfer and misrepresentation of founding capital. The motion was supported by original transfer records from my personal account, dated 12 years ago, totaling $300,000, and by the amendment to the operating agreement, which Margaret's forensic accountant had already established could not withstand legal scrutiny as a retroactive loan reclassification under the circumstances of its creation. By the time Daniel got to his office that morning, the firm's accounts were frozen. By the time he called me twice, then a third time, then a long voicemail I did not listen to that day, I was already in Margaret's office, going through the next steps. By the time his attorney called Margaret, we had already begun the process of establishing, in clear and documented terms, that the $300,000 I had contributed to the founding of that company was equity, not debt, that my role in the firm's financial management for its first 6 years constituted a material operational contribution, and that the amendment Serena and Daniel had engineered together was a fraudulent instrument designed to strip me of ownership I had never relinquished. The legal process was not fast. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think these stories sometimes skip the part where you sit in a lot of conference rooms and sign a lot of documents and have a lot of conversations that are exhausting and technical and nothing like the clean, satisfying moment you imagined when it all began. There were days when the grief hit me sideways, not the grief of losing him, exactly, because I had lost him long before I knew it, but the grief of losing the version of my life I had believed in. That grief is real and it takes time, and no one should tell you otherwise. But here is what also happened. The forensic review of the Delaware holding company revealed that the transfers Daniel and Serena had made over 14 months had been used to fund a renovation of a property that, under the terms of our marital estate, Daniel had contributed to using assets that were legally subject to division. That finding expanded the scope of the litigation considerably. The clients at that February dinner, one of whom, it turned out, had his own reasons to want clarity about the firm's financial structure, declined to renew their contracts while litigation was pending. The firm lost 2 of its 3 major accounts within 60 days. By the end of the summer, Daniel had agreed to a settlement. The terms were negotiated. I will not list them all. What I will tell you is that the company, the one I had funded, structured, and kept solvent through its hardest years, was dissolved as part of the settlement, and the remaining assets were distributed in a manner that Margaret described as appropriate given the full picture of founding contribution and documented misrepresentation. My grandmother's money did not come back to me in full, because that is not how litigation works, and I had understood that from the beginning. But what came back was enough. More than enough. And it came with something money cannot be assigned to, a legal record that said clearly, in formal language, in a court filing that exists permanently, what had been done to me and that it had been wrong. Serena left the city. I heard this through a mutual professional contact, not because I was tracking her, but because in a mid-sized industry, people talk. I do not spend time thinking about her. She made choices. Those choices had consequences. That chapter is finished. What I think about instead is this. I am 43 years old. I am a certified public accountant. I have my grandmother's remaining money in accounts with my name on them, only my name. Mostly on how to structure their initial investments so that what happened to me cannot happen to them. I have an office. My name is on the door. Not as part of anyone else's name. Just mine. The dinner table where I said those words about foundation and documentation, I drove past that restaurant a few months ago. Just the faint satisfaction of knowing that I had sat in that room, and held everything I knew inside me, and smiled and chosen the exact right moment to let one small, careful sentence do the work that a year of anger never could have. My grandmother used to say that freedom was sewn into every hem. I think what she meant was that the work you do quietly, carefully, with your own hands, it doesn't disappear just because someone tries to take credit for it. It holds the shape together. And when the time comes, it tells the truth on your behalf. I believe that then. I believe it now more than I ever have. If you are watching this and you are in the middle of something that feels too complicated to fight, too embedded to untangle, I want you to hear this. The complexity is not your enemy. The paper trail is your friend, the quiet is your power. And the right person, with the right documents, at the right table, changes everything. Thank you for watching. If this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about the strength it takes to build yourself back, you know where to find us.